The authorities, after first lying and then repeatedly obfuscating, said there would be a full and transparent investigation and that those responsible would be punished. Nothing near that has happened, while they continue to claim that his murder is an internal matter and that the outside world should not concern itself or interfere in the kingdom's sovereignty. They have claimed that 11 members of the murder squad have been detained, but only one has been named. No information has been provided by the authorities about where the 11 are being held and whether indeed they've even been brought to trial. Saud al-Qahtani, a key advisor to Mohammed bin Salman, has been directly linked to the murder. Yet he's said to be still in almost daily contact with the prince, possibly detained, but if so, only under light house arrest. 1 year on, and the Crown Prince is feeling increasingly confident that he's gotten away with a brutal killing. So confident indeed that he gave an interview to two American television networks, PBS and CBS. In the PBS interview, he says, "I get all the responsibility because it happened on my watch." Many commentators have read that as an acceptance of responsibility. I disagree. Rather, it is a complaint, a whine. I get all the responsibility. A petulant in tone and utterly lacking, in my view, in any measure of sincerity. When asked how it was possible that, as he claimed, he knew nothing of the plot to kill Khashoggi, he replied, "We have 20 million people. There are 3 million government employees." It was a fatuous answer, worthy of a Trump, and designed to enable him to slip away from taking any real responsibility. The prince is hoping that Western media will buy into his ploy. I fervently hope it will not. He has not accepted responsibility, though he claims to have. For if he had, then he would have accepted the truth, that the murder of Jamal Khashoggi is his to own. He has blood in his hands for this awful crime. Let me be clear. It is inconceivable that Mohammed bin Salman knew nothing about the plan to kill Jamal Khashoggi. The CIA has concluded that in all likelihood he ordered the killing, and the UN report backs up that view. Nothing of any significance happens in Saudi Arabia without the knowledge of the Crown Prince, who also serves as Defense Minister, Deputy Prime Minister, Chair of the all-powerful Council for Economic and Development Affairs, and Chair of the Council of Political and Security Affairs. He controls the world's largest energy company, Saudi Aramco, and runs the kingdom's massive public investment fund. He is all-powerful and all-controlling. As he has pursued his ambitions to be recognized as the leader of the Arab world, the prince has silenced any criticism of himself and his regime. Thousands languish in jail, many subjected to torture, including brave women who campaigned for their rights, moderate clerics calling for reform, peaceful protesters accused of terrorism, bloggers and citizen journalists who spoke up for reform on behalf of loved ones in prison. The murder of Jamal Khashoggi has denied to Saudi Arabia a desperately needed voice of moderation and thoughtful criticism. Khashoggi did not see himself as a dissident, as the Western media so frequently and wrongly chose to describe him in the days and months after his death. Rather, he was both a pragmatist and a patriot. He deeply loved his country and was broadly supportive of Vision 2030, the Crown Prince's bold plan to revolutionize Saudi society through sweeping economic reform. Khashoggi believed that the way to move Saudi Arabia forward was to strive for an independent and free media. He understood well the limits of just how far he could push that narrative on, but even when he was sacked for his efforts, and he was sacked several times, he never gave up pushing. It became clear to him in September 2017, as he saw those around him being arrested, that he must leave or face arrest himself. His columns for the Washington Post enraged Mohammed bin Salman. But go back to the first column for the Post, and you find this. "My friends and I living abroad feel helpless. We want our country to thrive and to see the 2030 vision realized. We are not opposed to our government and care deeply about Saudi Arabia. It is the only home we know of or want. Yet we are the enemy." Within a year of writing those words, he was dead, but his narrative has not been silenced, as Mohammed bin Salman had hoped. Rather, his murder has amplified that narrative. Citizens of Saudi Arabia and the wider Middle East will only realize their full potential in a society where a free media flourishes. Dictators and their lies do not endure. Speaking truth to power, even with all the terrible consequences it entails for journalists and authoritarian states, ultimately brings their lives crashing down around them. So I want to say this in memory of a brave colleague on the first anniversary of his murder. Thank you, Jamal, for your bold and courageous journalism, your dedication, your humor, and your kindness. You will not be forgotten. Your death is not in vain. Your struggle for free media in Saudi Arabia and the wider Middle East will be continued in your name, and it will win out. And to the man who caused his murder, Mohammed bin Salman, I say this: try as you might to escape it, the stain of your brutal crime will forever remain with you. Now, who would like to go first?
I'd be honoured to go first. Shall I put this? Does everybody hear me here? I was absolutely when I was the Arab Thinking Forum paid me the honour of asking me to come to speak about Jamal Khashoggi on the anniversary. Can we help? Let's have a go at this. I seem to have destroyed this piece of equipment. Thank you very much. I was absolutely determined to come here today to pay tribute to a great man, a great writer, and a great human being, somebody who gave their life for the truth. Although he died, he leaves a legacy, a standing reproach to the murderous regime which killed him, and somebody who brings great honor to the trade which he was such a distinguished part. That's the trade of journalism and reporting, which at its best, and as it was practiced by Mr. Khashoggi, is a trade which tells the truth to power, which shines a light on the bad and celebrates the good, which afflicts the comfortable and comforts the afflicted, to quote the great US journalist H.L. Mencken. And that is what Jamal Khashoggi did in his quiet but resolute way. But we're not just here but through him we can of course pay honor to so many other journalists who pursue their crafts around the world in difficult places. It's one of the things which Bill Law and I, coming from the West, don't have to. We tell truth to power. Somebody might complain to our editor, or maybe some politician won't speak to us. We don't risk being killed or tortured or disappeared. We don't risk the attacks on our family members. And this is something which makes me feel very humble, both in Britain, but also whenever I travel around the Middle East and around the rest of the world, I meet people who are risking their lives and their freedom and the security even of their families by speaking truth to power. So let's also remember today the many journalists across the world who are suffering, and in many cases, unfortunately, being killed and tortured for what they do. Let's reflect on the situation in Egypt, where maybe there are 400 journalists currently in jails, along with tens of thousands of political activists held in jails. People who really suffer and take enormous risks for their trade against, to tell the truth about a barbarous regime, a repressive regime. I think that there are 150 or so journalists in jail in Saudi Arabia, where Mr. Khashoggi was prevented from carrying on his craft. Turkey has unfortunately done great damage to its reputation. A country I greatly admire, but done great damage to its reputation by locking up journalists and Pakistan is another current case in point, another country I know well and greatly admire. But I meet journalists who are maltreated and threatened. And of course that applies in China, in Russia, in so many repressive regimes. And so I want to today, through Jamal Khashoggi, to honor and respect those who work so bravely that the world can understand better, or understand at all, the kind of the hard truths about countries which do terrible things. I also want to say that although I never met Mr. Khashoggi, I was a colleague of his at Middle East Eye, where he wrote, often anonymously, and that is something I feel extremely proud about. I want now to move on to something which causes me fresh shame, which is the attitude of Western governments, response of Western governments to the barbarous killing of Mr. Khashoggi. It goes without saying that the worst offender is the Trump's America, which seems unable to see that anything wrong took place. And the continued failure of the United States probably to make Saudi Arabia come to account for its barbarous acts really upsets me, because the United States ought to be, I was brought up to believe that the United States was the center of freedom. We learnt about its great battles for freedom. It stood up for democracy and liberty throughout the world when I was a young man, and now it's a supporter of barbarism and dictatorship. And that makes it, I have to say now, complicit with murder, barbarism, and dictatorship. I'd also, as a British citizen, as a proud Briton, the attitude of the British government really depresses me. The readiness to carry on relations with Saudi Arabia as if really nothing had happened. And of course, it's not just British indifference to the fate of Mr. Khashoggi which shocks me, but the continued British support of the Saudi regime as it carries out its murderous campaign in the Yemen, and we continue to supply arms and advice and help as that war carries on. And once again, I believe that, and maybe I'm wrong, but I believe that Britain stands up for rule of law, decency, respect for individuals, liberty, and our failure in this case and in many other cases in the Middle East is something which suggests that it's something which we must fight against. We must go on and on mentioning what happened to Mr. Khashoggi and so many like him. We cannot let this go. We cannot let our governments go on effectively collaborating in this kind of barbarism. Because if we don't stand up for liberty and decency and oppose barbarism and murder, who else will? We really do need, on the international stage and through direct relations with the governments of Saudi, Egypt, and elsewhere, to really drive home the message that we are appalled by the actions of those governments. And Mr. Khashoggi he was the one who stood up for the values which we ought to have been standing up for now. We are living in an increasingly dark and menacing world, with authoritarian regimes being celebrated, and even Western democracies coming to look more and more like authoritarian regimes. So those of us who are in this room, those of us who honor Mr. Khashoggi, those of us who are appalled by his death, those of us who want his murderers to be called to account, we're more and more an embattled minority. I honor everybody in this room today for taking the trouble, enormous trouble, to come here, those who are watching, those who continue to care. And this is what our humanity demands. And if we weren't here, we couldn't forgive ourselves, because what Mr. Khashoggi stood for was something that all of us stands for. He was a light of truth, a light of freedom, a light of honesty. And if only the Saudi regime, if only Mohammed bin Salman had the wisdom to know that he should listen to that very good and brave man. He wasn't listen to his advice, do what he would have brought Saudi to a so much better future than it now faces. And the same, of course, applies to the Sisi regime in Egypt. If only they could listen to moderate-minded, sensible, pragmatic, worldly wise opponents who don't want to change the world totally, just want to introduce into public debate a basic decency, and into public discourse a gravity and a seriousness, and into public conduct a basic morality. That was what Mr. Khashoggi did, and that, I'm afraid, is why he was killed. And so those of us today, we really must follow his example, share his risks, honor his legacy, sympathize with his family, and never let his memory die.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Move the microphone and hope it
Yes, please.
doesn't fall apart. There we go.
Thank you very much, Bill, Peter, and for the organizer and for everybody here. I'll try to not to take long time and to save some time for the question and answer. I'll try to just talk who's Jamal and why they killed Jamal Khashoggi, and what about the crime and the behavior for the Saudi regime, and what's happened after the crime since the last year, and what happened also inside the country, the courts, the trials, what we should do, and the responsibility and the future for Saudi Arabia with this regime. First of all, Jamal Khashoggi, we grow up and we learned that Jamal Khashoggi, he is the spokesperson on behalf of the Saudi regime. He was a person very close from the regime. He worked with the Saudi intelligence. He worked with member of the royal family. But later on, in 2017, when he left the country, I talked to him and we met here in London, and I said to Jamal, why you are here? Why you are working as a dissident at the moment? We used to listen to Jamal as pro-government. He said, but I never support the repression. And I never criticized the reformers. And I never allowed anyone working with me in any newspaper that I worked in to criticize the reformer. And I'm paying the price for that. He said, during the Arab Spring, I refused to listen to the government when they want to use me against the Arab Spring. And he said, I refused also to work against the right for the Palestinians and to support the Saudi regime with the normalizing with the Israel. And when we go to the archive and the history for Jamal Khashoggi, we will notice that. Yes, he used to be pro-government, but all the time he was saying, we don't have the best regime, we want the human rights, we want to protect the human rights, but we want to give time for our regime. So he was trying to push from inside the regime. Later on, in 2017, he believed this attitude will not work. Then he left the country because he noticed at that moment the regime is going from wars to wars and they will never listen from anyone trying to do the reform from inside. Jamal, until the last moment, he was trying nicely with the regime. He never talking about something maybe radical like us when we say we are completely disagree with the regime. We are completely disagree with the monarchy. Jamal was trying nicely until the last time, the last communication between me and Jamal, 10 days before they told him, the last message that I received from him was saying to me, Yahya, you are very aggressive. Please try to send very nice letter to MBS. Maybe he will read the question of conscience. I said to him, Jamal, Mohammed bin Salman MBS doesn't deserve that. I couldn't write nice letter to this dictator. He'll never listen. He said, if Mohammed bin Salman doesn't deserve that, our friend behind the mask, they deserve it. Please let's try all efforts to do that. I asked him, and he suggested that to write the draft, to send the letter to MBS. And I waited for the draft until then. They killed Jamal while he was trying with dissident like me to be nice with MBS, to try our best to do the reform without being aggressive and radical. Why they killed him? I believe we can't justify or answer this. There's no justification for this crime. Even if we say Jamal Khashoggi have secret information or he worked with the Saudi intelligence, or there's nothing to justify this crime. And by trying to answer this question why they killed Jamal Khashoggi is so difficult because it is all the crime from A to Z. It's illogic and we can't make logic from this tragedy story. The crime that's happened to Jamal Khashoggi, just as Peter said, they don't want anyone to talk against the regime. Also, they are talking very nicely, but if Mohammed bin Salman paying lots of money, billions of dollars for the PR company, and this is the only success for Mohammed bin Salman, the PR, and someone like Jamal Khashoggi writing articles in Washington Post or anywhere, they feel that will destroy this PR because people around the world at the moment, they will not believe these loads and loads of PR campaigns around the world by money, and they will start to believe the reality because it's very clear for the world. The crimes for the Saudi regime. Why I would like to mention some crimes for the regime while we are talking about Jamal Khashoggi, because I want to say this regime is committed lots of crimes. It's not just the crime for Jamal Khashoggi. They are right now. They are attacking the most sensitive place in our country. Before this time, before the 4 years and a half, we don't have real danger inside Saudi Arabia from Al-Houthi. And the responsibility at that time for the Saudi regime to try to push the Yemenis to go to the democracy. And Saudi regime, yes, they can't do that because they don't have democracy in their country, so they are not allowed to do that, and they are not able to do that in other country. So they tried to do something. They tried to have government working for Saudi regime as backguard for Saudi Arabia, and they failed with that. The same regime, they arrested large number of people, and we published number of 150 person, and later on, Bloomberg, when they interviewed Mohammed bin Salman, they asked him, have you arrested 150 prisoner of conscience? He said, no, it's not 150, it's 1,500. And they said, we are talking about the mass arrest, the recent mass arrest. He said, yes, the last mass arrest, it was 1,500 because we are fighting terror. So we noticed at that moment, we only know about 10% of the violations inside our country. That's because of the fear. That's because they are threatening people inside the country. And very few people, they are able to leak the information and to contact with us. So they said to him, this is very large number. He said, no, Erdogan, he arrested more than this number. Can you go to Erdogan and ask him why he's arresting people? Competition. It's not like competition. He's like to distract the question. At the same time, the Saudi regime, they arrested prime minister for another country, and they forced him, they slapped him, and they beaten him, and they forced him to resign from inside Saudi Arabia. And this is, I think, it's never happened in the history. And they committed lots of crimes, not just in our country, it's in the region. And I believe the only element it's still work and to protect the Saudi regime is the element for the Western allies. I believe the Western allies at the moment, they are worried about the future because they are looking for the oil and the stability. Oil at risk, and there is no stability at the region. All of these crimes and violations, it's happened from one regime. So if we're just talking about the crime and the murder for Jamal Khashoggi, they will try to cover up the story, or they will try to say, okay, we have trial inside the country, and there is investigation happen, and our court is independent. And when we talk about Yemen, they will talk about Al-Houthi and the danger for Iran. If we talk about the human rights activists, they will say they are traitors and talk to contact with the NGOs. But if we try to bring all of these crimes together, that will make it clear we are in front of the repression regime, and not just repression, but they are taking decision without ever thinking about the future. What's will going on? They never thinking about the future. So if this regime continue like this, we will face regime like Muammar al-Gaddafi maybe, because there is lots of similarity between the regime in Saudi Arabia and the stupidity from Muammar al-Gaddafi. After the murder for Jamal Khashoggi, lots of people around the world, they started to believe our narrative, and they started to listen to us. Before the murder, we were trying to talk to people around the world, and lots of people, especially officials, especially Western allies for Saudi Arabia, they keep repeating, MBS, he will bring the reforms. He need a time. You must wait for him. And I believe they want us to wait until 2030, when he destroyed everything in our country. After the murder for Jamal Khashoggi, I believe they started to change their mind. And I think you heard Macron when he was saying to MBS, you never listen. And MBS, he replied, no, I will listen this time. So officials around the world, they started to understand. Also the media, they feel shame at the moment to accept to be part of the PR. Yes, there is some media, they still in the PR for MBS, but they feel shame of it. Also politicians around the world, they feel shame to meet with Mohammed bin Salman, and they are afraid also from their people inside their countries. For example, if Boris Johnson want to meet with Mohammed bin Salman, he will think twice about the opposition parties in UK, NGOs, about media, about the British society. They will think about it, because the British society at the moment, they understand who is Mohammed bin Salman, and nobody able at the moment to have signs all around the London to say this is the person who will bring the change to the country, like 1 year from this time, when we have seen lots of signs about Mohammed bin Salman around London. The trials, I will say something about the trials in Saudi Arabia, and already I decided not to say it because it was confidential information. But yesterday we were in Netherlands in an event like this, and it's attended by the Dutch government, and it's attended by Saudi ambassador and his team. Saudi ambassador yesterday, he said something really stupid. And he talked about the court. And he said, why Dutch government supporting Yahya Seri here when he asked for international investigation? And that happened because in last April, 37 countries, they signed a statement against Saudi Arabia, and they signed at that statement, and they request at that statement to support the international investigation. Last week, another statement published by Australia, and it's joined by 27 countries until now, and the signatures is open until 8th of October. So Netherlands, they signed both, and they agreed in both. And yesterday they said, the Dutch government, they said yesterday in the event, we believe the murder for Jamal Khashoggi is a crime, and we believe we need international investigation, but we have good relations with Saudi regime and lots of buts, like, as you know, the Western allies with Saudi Arabia. But the ambassador, he have not accepted that, and he keep talking about the independent trial inside Saudi court. Then I felt myself desperate to talk about what's happened inside the court. The first hearing, it's go fine, like what they planned for it. The second hearing, Saudi regime, they allow some observers. They allow 5 observers from outside, from different countries around the world. The observers, they attended the court. And the judge, he told 5 of them they will face death penalty. The public prosecutor, he asked for death penalty for 5 of them. Al-Madani and Maher al-Mutrib and Saleh al-Tubaygi and others. One of them, he said to the judge in front of the observers, what we said in the last hearing is completely untrue about the rogue elements and such of things. We are doing our work, and we just obeyed the order, and we just following the orders that's given to us. And these orders is given to us in Riyadh, and we followed everything step by step, and we have not did anything wrong. If there is anything wrong, this is from the person who ordered us. Should I say his name? The judge, he said no. And we will stop the trial now, and we will see you in next hearing. And we have not seen the next hearing until now.
That's a joke.
From April until now, there is no trial. They completely stopped it. And they are trying, and at the moment, after that happened, lots of European, they met with MBS, and they talked to him about what's happened in the trial. And he keeps saying to them, I will take the responsibility, I will solve the issue. All the time he keep repeating that. Until now he announced this situation, and he said recently with
CBS and CBS. PBS and CBS.
He said that with 60 Minutes, and PBS, he said that also with Martin, the editor for the program. He said, I take the responsibility. And in 60 Minutes, she asked him, what does that mean? And he started to talk about 20 million, 3 million, and lots of numbers. And I believe nobody asked him about 3 million Saudis employees, because not all of them have saws and keep killing people and cutting people. Those people, they are doing their jobs. But we are asking him about those people working closely with him, and they went to the consulate to kill innocent journalists. So he tried to make distract about these numbers. I can't follow up with 3 millions. But by taking responsibility, this word is very important, but it's important in the democratic country. When they said, I take responsibility, that means he will go to resign. Or he will face the independent parliament, and in the parliament, they will question him. Or he will face the trial, because they have independent courts. In Saudi Arabia, in absolute monarchy, what does that mean? I will take the responsibility. We as Saudi society, what can we do with him? We don't have independent parliament. We don't have any independent courts. And he said, I can't do anything, but I take the responsibility. So it's just a word to give it to the Western allies and to the Western audience, because some of them understand this word. It's very great word, it's important word, but it's mean nothing in our country. It's completely mean nothing. In the future, I believe this regime continue with this repression and violations for a very long time because they always depend on three elements. They don't have any legitimacy. All the time, they don't have any legitimacy, nothing at all. But they have three elements, they work with it. First one, the Wahhabism, because they started with the Wahhabism. If anyone criticizes the regime, they will say it's forbidden. You are not allowed to criticize the regime. You must obey the order, the ruler, and you must just listen to them, and you are not allowed to say anything against them. In the past, if any one of the scholars of the Wahhabism say things for us, it's forbidden, we will listen. Because we just have one narrative in the past, the narrative for the regime. We will hear the same narrative in the school, in the Friday religious speech, in the Saudi media is the same narrative. Also the Saudi liberal and Saudi Islamists, they have the same narrative, but one of them with verses from Quran and the other one is from different sources. So, but it's exactly the same. They're fighting each other, and they must listen to the ruler. And we have seen one figure of the most liberal figure in Saudi Arabia. It's Saudi liberal, it's not liberal. He said, in our country, the most greatest thing, the monarchy. So this is the Saudi liberal. This is in the past, the Wahhabism did a lot to protect the regime. At the moment, the new generation, they will never listen for scholars. They paid by the government, and they are working for the government. And nobody will listen for these scholars if they keep saying it's forbidden to criticize the regime. Nobody will listen from the new generation. And Mohammed bin Salman as well, he destroyed these scholars because he is using them wrongly. It's about corruption of power. He has lots of power, but he corrupted to use this for power. He used some of those scholars to send them to advertising, for example, playing cards and such of things. So he used them in the wrong way. So there is no credibility for them with the new generation. The second element is the united between the royal family. They used to be united, and they used to rule every single thing inside our country. So people, they used to say inside Saudi Arabia, we don't have any institution inside our country. Also the military, it's not independent. We don't have constitution. We don't have parliament. We don't have independent tribes as well. They destroyed even the tribes. We don't have independent religious scholars to lead the people because they destroyed everything. So we only have the royal family, and if there is collapse, the tribes maybe fight each other. So we need to protect our country by this royal family, even if they are dictators. At the moment, they are not united. Mohammed bin Salman, he started with them, arrested his cousin, taking them to the Ritz-Carlton prison, tortured them, and he told the people around the world, those people, they committed corruption, and they are evils, and they are not able to lead the country, and he wants to lead the country alone. So the royal family, they used to be, for lots of people inside the country, as protection. At the moment, they are one of the high risk inside the country. They are afraid from the royal family. The third element, and it is the only thing is still working with the Saudi regime, is the Western allies. The Western allies, they still protecting this regime because they believe there is lots of money coming from this country. And we know Saudi regime, they are building their international relation with money. There is no real politics, or there's no real basement for the international relation. With the poor country, they're giving them funds, and they are building for them airports or hospitals to take them to their sides. And with the rich country, they are doing with them lots of contracts with weapons and arms to have them in their sides. But nobody believes in Saudi regime, and nobody have real ally with Saudi regime. And at the moment, there is no real ally with Saudi regime, and they depend completely on Donald Trump. And if Donald Trump disappears in one day, they don't have any allies. They don't have any allies. Even in our region, they don't have any allies. They have issue with Yemen, with Palestine, with Lebanon, with Iraq, with Qatar, with Canada, with Turkey, recently with Afghanistan, at the moment with Hamas. Canada, everywhere they have issues. And they start to do crisis more stupidly, and worse than any time before. So the Western allies, they keep the relation because there is lots of contracts and arms deal. But if they believe one day, and if they think about it, this regime will not bring the stability to the region. And also the oil, it's at danger with this regime. I believe they will start to do real pressure on the regime. And without the external pressure, the regime will continue like that because we can't do any internal pressure from inside. All the heroes, they are behind the bars at the moment. Salman al-Auda, as a reformer, he was at the court today and they're asking for death penalty for Salman al-Auda. And they keep asking for death penalty for lots of people, torturing people. So nobody can challenge the regime from inside. And the protection is from outside. So we need to pressure those regimes outside the country to pressure the Saudi regime. And without the external pressure, the regime will continue like that. And we will face new Gaddafi soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I will open the floor to questions. I just want to pick up on a couple of things, if I may. You raise a really interesting point, which is that Jamal was, in many ways, very much a part of the Saudi institution, wasn't he? And he reflected many of their views. And yet, he was forced out. And you mentioned Salman al-Auda, who's a moderate cleric, a voice of reason. He had 14 million Twitter followers. And the women who had pushed for the right to drive, Mohammed bin Salman grabbed them all up and threw them in jail. All of these people who would help him to realize the Vision 2030, which I think in many ways is a good document. It acknowledges the need for change and to use the economy to drive forward change. All of these things, very important. And yet, there is within this man a personality flaw that means that he turns on and destroys those who could be most useful to him to fulfill a better future for Saudi Arabia. And I thought, Peter, you made very eloquently the point about our responsibilities. We have been co-conspirators in this terrible murder, but beyond that, in a bigger issue. And it's about impunity and the sense of empowering an individual like Mohammed bin Salman to give him the sense that he is can simply do whatever he wants to do. And you know what? We in the West, we here in the UK, and in America and elsewhere, we are simply going to allow it to happen. And this rule of impunity, it doesn't just infect Saudi Arabia, it infects all of us. Because we are seeing it being played out in this country now. We are seeing it being played out in Washington. You know, this sense that people in power can do whatever they want, how they want, when they want. And of course, the murder of Jamal, simply, it is so horrific, so beyond the pale. He was a journalist, for God's sake. And our voices here, who should have shouted to the skies about the outrage of this, have been muted. And I think that's the great tragedy. We're here at the first anniversary of his murder. And in a year's time, where will we be? Will Mohammed bin Salman still have that sense of impunity? I think you raised many interesting points. He is vulnerable. I feel he is vulnerable. I feel that he behaves as an individual who is vulnerable, fearful of what is out there, fearful of real change. I think that he is really quite a weak individual. Anyway, those are some of my thoughts, but let's throw it out to the audience and take some questions. Yes, sir. Can you just identify yourself before?
Yeah, my name is Osama Dawish. I'm an Egyptian journalist live here in the UK. I have one question to speaker for Peter. Thank you for your speech. You mentioned that we are here to honor Jamal and honor his legacy and stand for his values. And I'm totally agree with you. But the problem is, as a journalist, me and you and Ben and many journalists in this room and 1,000 outside this room, what we have to do to have the strong impact, to put a real pressure on the UK government and the Trump administration and all the Western government to stop supporting this authoritarian regime in Egypt and Saudi Arabia, because we are in a real danger as a journalist. This is my question for you, for Yahya. after 1 year, Yahya, is it too late to calling for justice for Jamal? And if it isn't, what we have to do to achieve this justice for Jamal? Thank you.
Do you want to take that first, Peter?
It does sometimes, we do sometimes as journalists feel very impotent, like we're just, nobody cares. And we do our reports and nothing happens. But I think what we have to do is, speaking as a British journalist, we have to keep on pushing these issues up the agenda and writing about serious things which matter, and not pretending that this is not a matter, something which doesn't affect or shame us in the West. And there's lots of investigations that can be done into the links between business, the way that Western foreign policy, British foreign policy can be bought, it appears, the support by these money-rich, oil-rich. Saudi Arabia is not the only one. To try and restore honor in our own countries, and of course to lend our support to journalists in Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and across the Arab world, Turkey, who are under threat. Don't forget the sacrifices they are making. Don't allow them to leave the headlines, ever. That is the best I can offer.
In very short, it's not too late. And what's happened until now, the international pressure on the Saudi regime, it's not enough. Of course, it's not enough, but this has never happened to the Saudi regime. So what's happened after Jamal Khashoggi is completely different than what's happened before the murder for Jamal Khashoggi. What we need to do at the moment, from the legal side, is complicated because the criminals, they are in Saudi Arabia. So it's very difficult to take them in front of the court. But we need to focus in the political side because it's much easier and it's much effective, especially in the Human Rights Council. When we go to the Human Rights Council, yes, there is some effect for the human rights organizations, but at the end, the decision and the decision maker, they are politicians. So we need to keep the pressure with the politicians.
And just to add, I mean, your point about business, I think, is quite good because Mohammed bin Salman is very keen to get foreign investment into the country. So he has Davos in the desert, which is coming up shortly. And I think there are places there where pressure can be brought to bear on big companies to say, what are you doing? And to let the shareholders of those companies know that this company is going to sit down with a man who ordered the murder of a journalist, and that murder was done in a terrible, horrific way. Are you sure that you want to go to Davos in the desert? Think about that. Okay, yes, sir.
I have a question.
We just get you to give us your name, please.
Yeah, Abdullah Sidiya, Mauritanian journalist. Yahya, as you say when you talking with Jamal, he never been a Saudi opposition member. He refused to call him opposite, and even that he was killed with a horrible crime. You said that you're very extremism than Jamal, and you feel safe here in UK, and we are Arabic journalists from Gulf into Ocean. Are we safe to write every day or to produce some news against Saudi regime?
That's a very good question. Yeah, thank you.
Should I be honest or diplomatic with the answer? To be honest, nobody's safe from us here. Because if of course they can reach anyone if they wanted to. Because but if we believe in our work and if we believe in these values, we need to take the risk and we need to fight for the justice and we need to fight against these crimes. And we must take the risk. If we don't want to take the risk, we will be in the other side or we will be sleeping at our homes.
The other thing too is that families who are still in those countries, it's happened in Bahrain and in the United Arab Emirates and in Saudi Arabia, the families of dissidents who are exiled are being subjected to terrible pressures, being jailed on trumped up charges, being abused in jail, their bank accounts being frozen, their children denied scholarships, they lose their jobs. So it's very, very difficult. And I think Peter and I say we are hugely fortunate to be where we are, that we don't face any of those kinds of harsh difficulties. And I have a great deal of sympathy for people, journalists, Arab journalists who are trying to speak truth to this terrible power, that at some points they can't. And I understand that, and I think we have to understand that. And I think with Jamal Khashoggi, yes, he was a spokesperson for the Saudi government, but equally within that structure, he was a pragmatist, and he pushed when he could. And he did have one message that because I knew him, that he believed very strongly in, which was that the way forward for Saudi Arabia, for the Middle East, was through a free and open media.
Exactly, yeah.
And he did push on that, and he did lose his job from time to time, and then he'd get brought back in, and he'd get sacked again. But I think that you raise a very important point, and it's a point that, again, I think that our government needs to be addressing. Really, very, very important. So I thank you for the question. Yes, sir.
Yeah, Osama Rushdie, I'm Egyptian politician. Bill and Yahya, do you have chance for the MBS, the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman? Do you think he still has a chance to be a king for the Saudi Arabia after this crime? Yeah.
I'll let you answer that first of all, anyway. Yeah.
I wish not, but of course the chance is still available.
How we can face the world, how we can be a servant of the Haramain, خادم الحرمين الشريفين.
مش خادم الحرمين، حيكون خادم الكرسيين.
I think it's very likely that he will be king, and he will be king potentially for a very long time, but equally he has made many enemies, certainly
everywhere.
Within the families,
Everywhere.
within the tribes, within the religious establishment. Who knows how it will play out for him? I think a less impetuous and arrogant young man would, as Peter said, have listened to people like Jamal and other people and said, slow down. I mean, if he'd listened, he wouldn't have gotten himself into the Yemen war, perhaps, and that has caused huge suffering for the people of Yemen. So, yeah, I mean, we will have to see how that plays out. But, his father's very old and frail, so I think we should expect he will be the king, and probably sooner rather than later.
The moral
Well, that's the question.
I believe nobody believes in Mohammed bin Salman, whether inside the country or outside the country. Nobody believes he's a good leader. But there's a chance to be a leader, it could be.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Yes, my name is Fahad Gouidi. I'm a political activist from Saudi Arabia against Saudi regime, of course. I'm going to speak in Arabic, so I'm sorry if you gentlemen didn't understand. Just a few words about Jamal Khashoggi and what's happened to him.
Mr. Al-Asiri have mentioned very important point. He mentioned why Khashoggi has been assassinated, why he was murdered, and there is no reasonable answer for such a question. But I believe there is an answer. It's not logical, but it's most possible, and I believe that this is the mentality of the Saudi regime, and I believe, despite of all this media coverage that and all these atrocities that have been revealed, and talking about a death squad, and no one knows how many other victims of the Saudi regime. And despite all of this, I believe if we go back in time, a year ago, I believe the Saudi regime will continue, but with precautions after the murder of Khashoggi, because we are about a regime that have a system, and we know as opposition that Khashoggi could not consider himself an opposition, and yet he was murdered. So it's an arrogant regime. It's a regime that buy loyalty, and unfortunately the regime has acquired so many loyalties with money, with the arms deal, and some have mentioned the Yamama deal, which is a very famous. One air fighter was bought for $70 million, although the actual price was $11 million. So Al-Khashoggi was a soft critic. He wanted a reform, but he was murdered. We don't want this atrocity to be repeated. And now there are so many humanitarian organizations around the world ask for justice. However, until now, it hasn't been done because those who have the influence have been bought. This is very bad. We don't know what's the future and who will be leading the world if we cannot achieve justice. And finally, the death Khashoggi will remain an idea, and ideas never die.
Thank you. Thank you.
Any other questions? Peter, some thoughts from you.
Excuse me.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Sorry.
Please forgive me. I'm sorry. I'm
No,
sorry.
that's fine. Came late, so. I think we're living the most depressing and dark times, especially here in the West. I mean, over there, the whole situation that they're living and the mentality of the ruling family, that's been for a long time. But for us in the West, to tolerate such a person, knowing with a high percentage the accusations or even the reality, many people do believe that he is responsible for that crime. Yet, our interest leads us openly. Before, I mean, we would talk about the West following interests, but under the table. These days, it's depressing that it happens right in front of our eyes and openly with no shame. So I don't know how are we going to work with this? What kind of change, if our politicians at a high level seems to be corrupted by, we'll turn a blind eye as long as you're our friend and you're serving our interest. So how is this going to happen? I mean, it's puzzling, especially for the new generation, the Western generation who thought, you know, it's not going to ever happen openly. Now we're suffering from this.
Okay, Peter, do you want to?
Yes, I completely agree with what you're saying, and the support by the West for regimes such as Saudi Arabia, and the reaction to crimes such as the gruesome murder of Mr. Khashoggi takes away our moral right to condemn crimes which are committed by elsewhere. I mean, what is the meaning of condemning crimes by the Assad regime, for instance, when we completely cast a blind eye on a part of the crimes committed basically there's a rule of British foreign policy that we only condemn crimes committed by those we regard as our opponents. And you can I made a study once for Middle East Eye of the Twitter feeds of all the Middle Eastern British ambassadors, and our man in Saudi Arabia never says anything rude about MBS. Our man in Egypt never says anything remotely rude about Sisi, but of course, and our man in Yemen, who of course lives in Riyadh, there's nothing bad to say about and so on. It is a disgraceful state of affairs, and it is worrying that Brexit could make it worse, because there's this danger that we will need the support. Feel that we need the support. For instance, our man to move on to India. and the recent intensification of the crisis in Kashmir and the illegal actions of the Indian government, Sir Dominic Asquith, the High Commissioner there, the British High Commissioner, with so many disappearances, with a crackdown going into 10 weeks, all he's been able to say is he's keeping a watching brief on the situation, and that is an insult to any. It is an absolutely outrageous position to take, and Sir Dominic Asquith should feel ashamed of himself, as should, of course, Dominic Raab, the British Foreign Secretary.
My name is
Yes, please.
Mohammed Abu-Danin. I am British Egyptian journalist. My question is, to be honest, it built on the words of this gentleman. I would like to ask, especially for Yahya Assiri, do you think killing or assassination of Jamal, it was the main reason regarding of his activity, or is it not activities because he was, as we know, soft criticizing of the regime, or because he was part of the regime before he turned out to be criticizing?
Yeah. Basically, there is no real reason behind the killing, except, as Fahad said, it's the ignorance and the stupidity from the regime. So there's nothing to say. For example, I have seen that. Why I'm saying there is no real reason, because I have noticed that in lots of media, they are suggesting that Jamal Khashoggi used to work with the Saudi intelligence. That means he has lots of secrets, and they are worried from that. This is completely not true, because he was working with the intelligence not to keep the secrets. He was spokesperson on behalf of Saudi al-Faisal, and that's it. And spokesperson is not the secrets keepers. So it's not about that, but because Jamal Khashoggi, he keep criticizing the regime, even nicely, but people, they are listening to him, and he's writing in Washington Post and in other international newspaper. So they want to silence anyone. And I believe if anyone else enter the consulate, not Jamal Khashoggi, they will kill him. Not just Jamal. But Jamal, he's the one who entered the consulate.
Thank you. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Yahya. And thank you all for coming. And I think if I could just reflect on your statement, you cannot murder ideas. And I do believe that the strongly felt aspiration among Arabs, young Arabs, for freedom, that can't be killed either. And tyranny and dictatorships, they do fall. So I don't think we should lose hope. I think we should persevere. And I thank you all for coming. And let us carry on the struggle in the name of Jamal. Thank you.
Thank you.